Entered the no delusion zone. I'm David Debatto. Today, I'm very happy to have a repeat offender back with me, someone who's appeared. Actually, he was I think, the first guest on my podcast when I first started doing this not very long ago. His name is Jonathan Fink, and he has his own very successful podcast on YouTube called Silicon Curtain. And I very much encourage you to go there after you're through watching this video. Jonathan has a master's degree in Russian. He studied Russian culture, history, and language at St. Petersburg, Russia. And since then, he spent the majority of his adult life studying Russian culture, Russian history, the Russian military, intelligence services, and so forth. He is a geopolitical analyst who appears on media platforms all over the world discussing, among other things, the war in Ukraine and, of course, Russia and its military intelligence services and its many actions around the world today. And he is also on panels. He actually has put together his own panels on think tanks and discussing the Ukraine-Russia war, including one in Kyiv recently and another one in Europe. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to once again welcome to the No Delusion Zone, Jonathan Fink. Welcome, Jonathan. Don't know if you can hear me. I can't hear you.
When I first appeared, it was a fledgling channel. Now it has its own substantial audience, and you've had some extraordinary guests on the channel as well.
Yes, I've been very fortunate. It's been a slog, but it's taking off very rapidly. So I'm very happy. Jonathan, I know you're pressed for time, and I want to get to a couple of points here right away. First of all, what's your take on the new story about Russian interference here in the States, United States, and this Russian supported media group called Tenant Communications here in America?
I mean, this is not a surprise. My methodology is to not necessarily focus on people's political backgrounds, not to focus on their authority or not. I simply look at the narratives that they're telling and try to understand whether it's organic or inorganic. That basically means, whether I agree with them or whether I agree with them or not. Are they telling a story that they think is genuine? Are they telling that story out of the sort of, let's say, the goodness of their hearts and no one's pulling their strings, as it were? And I think that's part of normal political discourse, even if I don't agree with a single word they say. But where you see big chunks of Russian propaganda being regurgitated in an undiluted form, an undigested form, and this happens on a repeat basis systematically, then of course, I start to get suspicious. What I will then do is say, okay, who are they connected to? Where is this influence coming? And who in turn are they influencing? I think it's a network effect. So it's not a surprise in any way. I suspect that this is the tip of the iceberg that we're seeing here. And it's not just going to be conservative influences who are encompassed in this. There are going to be voices from across the political spectrum, but especially the hard left and the evangelical right. I think this is going to ensnare a lot of people. I wonder if the DOJ have the, let's say, the strength and resolve to release this list of names before the election. That's going to be really interesting.
Well, I agree with you. As we discussed off air, Russia's doing this all over the world, but America being America and its importance to NATO and the war in Ukraine, of course, their efforts at this disinformation and propaganda campaign is focused on America. But let me ask you a related question. You're, of course, headquartered in the UK. As you know, there were a number of very violent riots recently in the UK over a stabbing incident that was blamed on an illegal immigrant, which the propaganda, the impetus for the riots, a lot of them were based on falsehoods, lies, propaganda by Russian operatives. What could you tell me about that, and also the extent of Russian media infiltrating in the UK?
I think in media, it's far less pronounced. We have our own oligarchs, we have our own editorial biases in this country, and they are exceptionally damaging. We have the clickbait mechanic that influences both online and legacy media, which really distorts reporting towards focusing on trauma, despair, and these kind of things. So we have weaknesses and problems. I don't necessarily think that Russian money is actually affecting that much of it. They would have to spend billions upon billions upon billions to actually, I think, change a significant number of minds in the UK. So they probably don't bother that much. But we do have, problems. We have problems with appeasement-minded experts, with geopolitical analysts. We have timid politicians. We have limited money, especially in a post-Brexit world, in order to reform our military. And that's not just the current government or the former government that brought Brexit about. This is something that is decades long, the underinvestment in military. So we have issues. I don't think Russian pollution of our information sphere is the worst of them. I think it's a fraction of what we're seeing in the US. Their main targets are France and Germany, it has to be said, and especially Germany, where they can really make much more of an impact and where they can try to whitewash their crimes far more effectively. When it comes to the extreme right and the riots that happened, I wasn't in the country, and of course, I observed with increasing alarm. What on earth is going on? You get quite bound up in it if you're not actually there, and it can seem far more significant than it actually is. But it fizzled out very, very quickly, and actually, there was a strong counter-reaction from civil society, from moderate society, on both the left and the right political spectrum. People came together to condemn the far right. And even some politicians who have dabbled in, I would say, right-wing populism for their own political benefit, they roundly came out. And some of the media, which has been extremely toxic in stoking these anti-immigration points of view and warping and distorting what is a genuine problem, even those media who had capitalized on these issues came out and disavowed or disowned those far-right protests. So I think Russia, certainly their role in this is to pour petrol on the flames. I think history will show that some of the ringleaders of those riots certainly will seem to have connections with the GRU and influencers. And I think probably Russia was hoping that they would blow into something more. I think the people that were orchestrating those riots certainly felt overconfident, and they overestimated the popular support they would get, which in the end was extremely marginal. So fortunately, it blew over. And I think, as with whatever happens with Russia, and this is what our leaders don't get, Russia will probe and it will push to see whether a weak chinks in the armor. And if, as in the UK, it finds that it's meeting bone, as it were, the old sort of Lenin thing, you poke your bayonet in through flesh, and where you meet bone, you stop. It met bone here in the UK. So what do? Do they escalate against an impenetrable barrier? No, they don't. They're smart. They will take their money and they'll invest it somewhere else where it will have more of an impact. And it seems that the US, dare I say it, there's far more flesh before they reach bone, and they are still pushing, probing there, whereas the UK is probably not a good target for them at this point.
I have to agree with you. Although London seems to be a favorite atomic target for Medvedev and some of the other crazies in the Kremlin whenever that comes up. But I agree with you. And as we've talked before off air and during other interviews, MAGA here is so deeply entrenched in the American culture, and the Russian propaganda machine has really tight and close ties within MAGA. So here, when these things happen, there is not the pushback that there was in the UK during those riots. You don't have as many either centrists or people on the left opposing such actions here on the right. They just either don't exist, or, in my opinion, they're just far too timid, which is part of the huge problem here in America, both with the media, especially not pushing back more forcefully against the far right and far left, but the public. They're just cowed, disinterested, whatever, and they allow MAGA and the far right to control the sphere, the information sphere, and the narrative, and that's very, very dangerous. I want to stay in the UK for a little bit, if I could. Recently, the UK, the government of the UK, talked about the use of Storm Shadow, possibly being used longer range within Russia. What two-part question? What's your opinion on the UK's support, military support, thus far for Ukraine, and what about the Storm Shadow? Are they going to allow Ukraine to use it with unlimited range, or as they see fit, or are they going to put controls on it similar to what the US has unfortunately done with ATACMS and HIMARS?
I think it's a mixed bag, isn't it? Because the UK does not seem to want to micromanage how Ukraine uses those weapons. They will, of course, and I think this is probably correct, they will want those weapons to be used against military targets. But I think there's a degree of trust of Ukraine that it will use those in a highly surgical and highly targeted way, and it will use it against military targets. I think with their own homegrown drones, they will do a lot more to hit infrastructure and so on, sort of fixed targets, energy targets. It's less likely that they'll be using the Storm Shadow to do that when drones can do the job. They will be choosing airfields, missile launch sites, this kind of stuff. I'm not a military expert, but I think the UK seems to have less caution, and it seems to have more trust in its ally, Ukraine. I think it's also significant that we have Zaluzhny, who is ambassador in the UK. And in the recent visit of our Secretary of State, who accompanied Blinken to Kiev, you could see this little grinning figure in a suit standing behind them in the background, and it was Zaluzhny who was accompanying them on that trip. He may not have been in the foreground for all the PR and razzmatazz. I rather suspect he's in the background, coordinating with the UK, making sure that trust that we have in our ally is maintained. Unfortunately, it does seem that the US is far more cautious, far less trusting. And as we discussed in a video we recorded earlier, the US is stuck in a Cold War mindset. It still looks at Russia as a viable player on the world stage, as a geopolitical giant, as a player that needs to be accorded that needs to be accorded some level of respect, because the Soviet Union was an adversary that did have some red lines, that did have a certain respect for the rules of the game, and they may have been our adversary, but they were not an out-and-out mafia state. So this is a complete misreading of what Russia is. I think because Russia has targeted its own citizens or dual citizens on the territory of the UK and caused a fair degree of mayhem with Litvinenko and Skripal, plus assassinating so many of its sort of bankers and so on British soil. I think we have the measure of Putin's regime. We no longer see it as a legitimate sort of state run by a credible head of state. It is a mafia outfit run by a thieving gopnik. In that sense, I think we have for a long time wanted Storm Shadows to be used in a far less prescriptive manner. The question, of course, is it's Friday. We were expecting some kind of announcement. We don't expect ATACMS to be authorized, but the US will be, in a sense, using its proxy, the UK, to do things that it feels are politically off the table for it. Whether that is because of long-term caution, escalation management, or the election cycle, or both combined, which is my suspicion, I think they will let the UK do more. We're expecting the announcement. As far as I can tell, at time of recording, it has not come. That is an extreme disappointment, but let's see if by the end of the day we have some news on that.
Another two-part question. Do you see any change in the support for Ukraine with the after the elections, fairly recent elections in the UK? And I guess the second part of that question is, well, I'll let you answer the first part because it may be longer than I had thought.
I think it is. The no, there's no change, and I will answer it in a two-part way. There's no change because the support for Ukraine was already extremely high in the UK, and there's been no drop off in that, and there's nothing happened that would affect that. In fact, Ukraine has been in the headlines more because of Russia's attacks on the Children's Cancer Hospital. I mean, Russia's been doing things that will simply double down in the UK on people's support and on their views that Russia is a terrorist state that is out of control. What has, I think, and unfortunately, this did not feature very highly in the election. The election was all about domestic issues. I ran a pre-election debate on the topic of Ukraine with people who were representative prospective candidates for the left, the right, and somebody from the centre as well. In fact, one wasn't a candidate. Sorry, one was somebody who served in the armed forces of Ukraine, but previously had been, a member of the Conservative Party. So we had this, I call it bipartisan debate. It didn't get a huge lot of traction, unfortunately. And that's because the election was all about domestic issues. What has, however, re-engaged people is Kursk. And I think this is very telling that it's happened right across the board. I've seen my YouTube figures massively spike up in August. We covered a lot of kind of Kursk stories, but the audience, there was a massive growth in the appetite. And I think that has changed the perception, not just in the UK, but in the US. Various polls show a huge uptick in people who are supportive of Ukrainian victory. And I think what Kursk has done is to say, look, this narrative about stalemate, this narrative about Ukraine not being able to win has been prevalent, and Russia has wanted to encourage that. And actually, allies, unfortunately, have encouraged it by the kind of warfare they have forced Ukraine into fighting, attritional, static warfare, where Russia's advantage in numbers of artillery pieces and men, unfortunately, it doesn't win out decisively, but it certainly has an incremental advantage there. Ukraine has changed the game and has created a form of mobile warfare, which lends itself not just to battlefield advantage, but informational advantage. And this is something that so many analysts have completely missed. It has given a strong boost to morale within the armed forces and on the civilian front. It has given people an incentive to mobilize and join the army when that was lacking, when allies have dithered and not given the armaments that would help Ukrainians to get passionate about serving their country. Who wants to be thrown at the front when they don't have the equipment to do the right job? It's something, unfortunately, which is not necessarily recognized really much on the Allied side. And they've shown they can win. They've shown Russia is a paper tiger, that Russia has no borders. And on every level, I think it's a super, super smart campaign. To tie that answer in with Storm Shadow, we need to support the further success of Kursk. And the provision of long-range deep strike weapons is absolutely critical to help Ukraine maintain what it's gained on Russian territory and potentially, propel it to further victories.
We're on the same page there as far as the analyst having missed a key component of the Kursk campaign, which is morale, the Ukrainian morale. Rightly so, analysts, especially military analysts, focus on the tactical and strategic elements of what Ukraine did. But they as you said, they tend to miss out on the intangibles, which is the incredible boost that it gave Ukraine, both their military and the civilians in Ukraine, a reason to have optimism and joy and hope again. It was huge. Let me ask you, Jonathan, as a lifelong student of Russia, what effect, if any, do you think that the Kursk campaign by Ukraine is actually having, not Russian propaganda, not some of the news we see, but actually having on the Russian people and the iron grip that Putin has had over them since he came to office? Is it changing at all? Will it change? What's your thoughts on this?
There are definite changes, but I think to put them in the language of Russians rising up and resisting and revolting, I think that is overly optimistic. That's not how we've seen the Russian population behave. Those who oppose Putin's regime have left the country by and large. Those who remain either just want to forget it's all happening and stick their head in the sand and carry on living their lives, either their lives of poverty or their lives of going out to restaurants, cafes, and whatever. So unfortunately, you're not going to see much political organization in that sense. And then you have this proportion of the population estimated to be anywhere between sort of 15 and 25%. No one really knows. But those who are really hooked into this Z Patriot extremist network, they're likely to criticize Putin. And Kursk has actually, some of them, one of them in particular, got really drunk and recorded some segments which were later pulled, where he in Prigozhin style, he takes the gloves off and he castigates Putin, not because of the war, but because the war is not successful enough, not because they're killing Ukrainians, because they're not killing enough Ukrainians. So I think we have to be measured there. And the pressure from Putin is coming from both sides. Those who want to see things change in order to become more genocidal, and those who oppose the war are either weak or unfortunately delusional or disorganized, and they're out of the country anyway, so they can't really bring that to bear. But that's not to say that Kursk isn't a success and that we don't need many more Kursk incursions, because I think we do, because Putin's regime is fragile and brittle, and to an extent it depends on the support of the intelligence services, and it depends on the support of the oligarchic business community. But don't get me wrong, they don't have genuine oligarchs. And, the deal here is that you're loyal to the Tsar or to the mafia boss, and in return, you have a patch that you can farm, or you have wealth that you can enjoy. So there's not an independent kind of political constituency here. But there'll come a point potentially where they're going to lose all their money. And at that point, they may well be some kind of mutiny or coup. It doesn't actually matter what that is. What we have is a brittle regime. We have a strong man who is being seen to be increasingly weak, and Kursk has done that incredibly effectively. They've shown him to be an emperor with no clothes. And what the Russians hate more than anything is weakness and a weak leader. And it actually doesn't matter where the collapse eventually happens. What Kursk is doing is showing us the fault lines and fissures in the system. What we should be doing, all our efforts should be in placing more pressure on that system and not worrying what's going to happen next, not worrying in what way it collapses. Because, whether it's Patrushev, whether it's someone else, it really doesn't matter, because their main concern is going to be to consolidate power within Russia. And we shouldn't delude ourselves that the next regime is going to be a liberal democratic regime. If someone who calls themselves a liberal comes to power, they will simply be, I think, a puppet of this sort of hierarchical intelligence services led system. So let's just forget about that. We can't control what happens in Russia, but we can put pressure on that system to the point where it fissures, cracks, and collapses. And change is the only chance for Ukraine to be victorious. Change is the only chance for Russia to reform. And I think we should be going with that. Whereas the policy of escalation management is to try and delay and prevent that moment from happening. And that costs Ukrainian blood. That timidity, that misreading of the situation is being paid for by Ukrainian blood. And it is appalling.
They've opened a crack. Ukrainians have. They've opened a crack in this whole issue that you've just talked about. And it comes back again to the long-range missiles. They're now holding on to a relatively small part of Russia, but it's inside Russia, and it's not affecting the Russian population yet much. They need to get the support of the West and supply them with everything they need, most importantly, long-range weapons. Therefore, they could expand this buffer zone, make a bigger buffer zone within Russia that's virtually unassailable. And the Russian population, I'm sorry, they are what they are. And they're shrugging their shoulders because they're afraid, they're disinterested, they even maybe support the war. It's going to take a long time and a larger area of Russia being held by Ukraine and really showing the emperor, the czar, without clothes before they start to realize, we have an invading army in a large part of our country. Maybe Putin isn't really what he says he is. And then it's still going to take some time, but we have to help them do that. And like you're saying, this lack of escalation and this fear of, we can't do any more. We can't allow them to strike further into Russia is insane, because it's going to take long anyway. And it, like you said, it doesn't matter who takes over for Putin. We just have to get rid of Putin and then see what happens with the next guy and hammer him if possible. But it needs to be a continual pressure on the Russian population and the Russian government and the Russian military. And right now, except for Ukraine, nobody's doing that. And that's a disgrace. And it's got to change. And I'll leave you with the last word, because I know that you have to go soon.
Yeah. I mean, the last point I want to make is a really interesting impression I got from an interview that I saw earlier today. And this tells you, I think, a lot. Russians are not citizens of their country. They are a population that inhabit a territory, and that territory is controlled by a mafia clique. And that's simply, I think, all you need to know. But this is a very illustrative story of what may happen, how many Russians think. So this is a girl, a teenager, on the territory of Kursk. In the first instance, she says, well, and she's asked what's she going to do. She says, well, first of all, if Kursk is retaken by Russians, she said, I can't stay there and I can't go to Russia. And she's asked why. She said, well, I'll be seen as a traitor and a collaborator. And she said, that's already happening online. Her acquaintances and friends, because she is in Ukrainian-controlled territory and because she's alive, are already branding her as a traitor. This is extraordinary Stalinist. But anyone who knows Russian history will see some familiarity in this. So she's asked, what's she going to do? She shows no patriotism whatsoever. All she shows is simple, and this is how I think many people understand this. Many people in the West actually will as well. But it's hugely prevalent in Russia. She's simply thinking in terms of her own advantage. She's thinking, well, she says, I'll go to Ukraine and maybe I'll get a grant to study there. And then from there, because I can get Ukrainian citizenship, I can go and study in the EU and make some money. And it's like, so what happens to being Russian? It seems that that's actually not such a big deal. Just like Russia doesn't have borders, Russians, if they see a personal interest in it, they'll go with the flow, and they'll find a new master and a new territory that suits their individual situation far better. And I think a lot of people will think in that way. So we tend to project our patriotism, our concepts onto Russia, and we really have to stop, because they don't work and they lead to strategic errors.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jonathan, and I wish we could go on further. Next time, perhaps we will, but I know you have to run. So, Jonathan Fink, the host of Silicon Curtain on YouTube. I encourage everyone to go and then subscribe to his channel. You will not regret it. Jonathan, thank you very much. Take care, and let's do this again soon.
Definitely. Thank you, David.
You bet. And as I always tell everyone, take care, stay safe, and most importantly, stay sane.